16,500 feet above the sea, in the high Himalayas of northern India, there is a lake so small you could walk around it in minutes. For most of the year, it is frozen solid, buried under snow and silence. One of the most remote and forbidding places a human being can stand. But for a few weeks each year, when the ice retreats, the water turns clear and reveals what has been waiting beneath it for over 1,000 years. Bones, hundreds of them. Skulls and ribs and shattered limbs, scattered across the lake bed and along the frozen shore. Not a handful, not a dozen. The remains of somewhere between 300 and 800 human beings lying in and around a single tiny lake at the top of the world. Who were they? How did so many people die in a place this hard to reach? A place with no village, no shelter, no reason to be. For 80 years, that question has drawn rangers, scientists, and the merely curious up the mountain. And every answer they found only made the mystery deeper. Because the deeper they looked, the stranger it became. The dead did not all belong to the same people. They did not all die in the same century. Some of them came from the other side of the world. And the most disturbing discovery of all is not how they died, but the fact that this remote, frozen lake somehow killed them again and again, separated by 1,000 years. The locals have a name for it that needs no translation. Skeleton Lake. Tonight, we climb to its shore and we try to answer a question that has resisted everyone who ever asked it. Who are the dead of Roopkund? To understand Roopkund, you first have to understand where it is, because the location is not a detail. It is the heart of the mystery. The lake sits in the Chamoli district of Uttarakhand, in the Indian state that borders Tibet and Nepal. This is the high Himalaya, not the foothills the tourists know, the real thing, where the air thins to half the oxygen of sea level, and the weather can turn lethal in minutes. The lake lies in a bowl-shaped hollow at the foot of the Trishul Massif, a mountain named for the trident of the god Shiva, rising over 23,000 feet. Around the basin stand the peaks of Nanda Gunti and the sheer rock wall of a ridge called Junar Gali. There is no easy way in. There never has been. To reach Roopkund, you have to walk. The route begins in quiet mountain villages and climbs for days, roughly 50 kilometers of trail that winds up through dense oak and rhododendron forest, where the mist hangs between the trees and the only sounds are your own breath and the wind. For most of human history, only shepherds and pilgrims came this way. It was not a place you visited. It was a place you passed through quickly before the weather changed. Above the tree line, the forest gives way to the bugyals, the high alpine meadows, rolling carpets of green that stretch toward the snow line. Places with names like Ali Bugyal and Bedni Bugyal. They are breathtaking. They are also a warning. Up here, there are no trees to shelter under, no caves, no walls. When the sky turns, there is nowhere to hide. Remember that. It matters more than anything else in this story. Beyond the meadows, the green dies away into rock and scree and permanent snow. The air grows thin enough to make your head pound and your steps slow. And then, tucked into its hollow beneath the Trishul wall, you reach it. A small, round pool of water, barely 40 meters across and only a few meters deep. After days of climbing, it can seem almost disappointing. Until you look down. For most of the year, you would see nothing at all. Just a sheet of ice and snow. Roopkund is frozen solid for the majority of its existence, thawing only briefly in the autumn months. And it is in that narrow window, when the ice loosens its grip, that the lake gives up its secret. The clear, shallow water turns into a window, and through it you see the dead. This is why they call it Skeleton Lake. And the first question anyone asks, the question that seems so simple, is the one that has never been fully answered. How did they get here? Who would climb to one of the most punishing places on earth in such numbers, only to die? To begin to answer that, we have to go back to the man who first told the world what was up here, and the year he found it could not have been worse. For centuries, the lake had been known only to the people who lived in its shadow. The shepherds who drove their flocks up to the meadows in summer, and the pilgrims who walked these paths to honor a goddess. They spoke of the bones the way you'd speak of a haunted place, quietly, as a warning. The mountains, they said, did not forgive disrespect. And then, in the middle of a world war, an outsider climbed up to see for himself. The year was 1942. The world was consumed by the Second World War, And even in these remote mountains, the British colonial authorities were watching the high passes nervously, afraid the Japanese might try to slip an army through the Himalayas into India. It was into this tense, suspicious moment that a forest ranger named Hari Kishan Madwal climbed up toward Roopkund and stumbled onto a scene that would haunt investigators for the next 80 years. What Madwal saw, he could barely process. Human bones everywhere, lying in the shallows, heaped along the banks, visible through the ice. Hundreds upon hundreds of skeletons in a place where no one should have died at all. He reported it to his superiors, and in 1942, with the war raging, there was only one explanation anyone wanted to hear. A hidden invasion force. The British feared the bones belonged to Japanese soldiers who had tried to sneak through the mountains and perished in the cold. A secret army that had frozen to death before it could strike. For a brief moment, Skeleton Lake was a wartime mystery, a possible threat to be assessed. But the moment anyone examined the bones closely, that theory collapsed. These were not soldiers. They carried no modern weapons, no uniforms, no 20th century equipment. They were old, centuries old. Whatever had happened here had happened long, long before the war, before the British, before living memory. The invasion theory was dead, and in its place stood a far more unsettling puzzle. A mass grave at the top of the Himalayas, with no war, no battle, and no record to explain it. It would take more than a decade for the world beyond these mountains to even hear about it. And when they did, the theories began to pour in, each one trying and failing to explain the impossible scene at the top of the world. The discovery was made public in the late 1950s, and it set off waves of investigation that continue to this day. The first thing that astonished researchers was not the number of the dead. It was their condition. Because at this altitude, in the dry, frozen, oxygen-starved air, the mountain had done something extraordinary. It had preserved them. These were not just bleached white bones. On some of the bodies, flesh still clung to the frame. Hair, skin, nails. The freezing temperatures and thin, dry air had mummified them, holding back the rot that would have erased them anywhere else in centuries. When a National Geographic team retrieved around 30 skeletons in the early 2000s, they were stunned to find tissue still attached to some of them. Human remains over 1,000 years old, frozen in time. And it was not only bodies. Scattered among the dead were their belongings, the everyday evidence of who they had been. Wooden artifacts, iron spearheads, leather slippers, rings, bangles, even fragments of what may have been musical instruments. These were not the remains of an army, or of monsters, or of ghosts. They were the remains of ordinary people, carrying ordinary things, who had walked up here for some reason, and never walked back down. The Anthropological Survey of India launched a study in the 1950s, gathering samples that are still displayed in a museum in Dehradun to this day. They measured the bones, they counted the dead, and they confirmed the staggering scale of it. The remains of more than 300 individuals, with later estimates ranging as high as 800. Men and women, young and old. An entire community of the dead, in a place that could not support a single living soul. Sit with that number for a moment. 300 to 800 people. To put it in perspective, that is not a lost traveler or an unlucky family. That is the population of an entire village. All of them somehow ending up dead at 16,000 feet, around a pool of water you could throw a stone across. How does that happen even once? And as we'll see, the truly chilling part is that it may not have happened only once at all. For decades after the discovery, Roopkund existed in a strange limbo, too remote to study easily, too astonishing to ignore. Slowly, it transformed from a forgotten horror into a destination. The trek to Skeleton Lake became one of the most famous and sought-after high-altitude treks in all of India. Thousands of people made the climb, drawn by the beauty of the mountains and the thrill of the macabre. And that popularity came at a terrible cost. The dead were not left in peace. Trekkers handled the bones. They rearranged them for photographs, and some, appallingly, carried them away as souvenirs. Skulls and bones that had survived 1,000 years of ice were vanishing into backpacks, scattered to homes around the world. A priceless archaeological record, one of the most important ancient burial sites on the planet, was being looted, one trophy at a time, by people who didn't understand what they were destroying. It wasn't only the bones at risk. The fragile alpine meadows, the bugyals, were being trampled and eroded by the sheer weight of foot traffic. Ecosystems that take decades to recover were being worn away in a few seasons. The lake that had kept its secret for 1,000 years was being loved to death. And eventually, the authorities would have to make a hard decision about who could come here at all. But that is a story for the end. For all the visitors, all the photographs, all the bones carried down the mountain, the central question still had no answer. Scientists had counted the dead. They had dated some of them. They had catalogued their belongings. But they could not say who these people were, where they had come from, or the question that mattered most: what had killed them? And so the theories multiplied, each one reasonable, each one, in the end, wrong. Was it an epidemic that struck them down? A landslide that swept them into the water? A mass ritual suicide? An army that lost its way? For half a century, brilliant minds proposed and discarded explanation after explanation. To understand why the real answer is so unsettling, we first have to walk through the ones that failed. And the failures themselves tell a story of how hard it is to imagine the truth, when the truth is stranger than anything we expect. The first serious theory was disease, an epidemic. Perhaps a group of travelers had been struck down by some illness, cholera or plague, and died together in this remote spot. It is a tidy explanation. Large numbers of people dead in one place at roughly the same time. But it falls apart on inspection. The bones told a different story. These people had not wasted away from sickness. Many of them bore something far more violent, and the pattern of their injuries pointed somewhere disease could not reach. The next theory was a landslide or an avalanche, a wall of rock or snow that buried a group of travelers and swept their bodies into the lake. The mountains here are certainly capable of it. But this explanation has problems too. The bodies were not crushed and entombed the way an avalanche would leave them. They were scattered around the shore, in and beside the water. And the wounds on the skeletons did not match the random, catastrophic damage of a rock slide. They were specific. They were concentrated. They were almost all in the same place on the body. Some proposed darker ideas, a mass ritual suicide, a sacrifice. A group of devotees who had climbed to this sacred place to die together for their faith. It is the kind of theory that fits the eerie atmosphere of the lake, but there is no evidence for it at all. No shrine at the lake itself, no sign of a planned, willing death. And again, the injuries argued against it. These people had not died peacefully by their own hand. Something had struck them hard and from a single direction. Then there were the traders. Tibetan merchants, perhaps, crossing the high passes with their goods, caught out by the weather. This one had real merit, People genuinely did cross these mountains for trade, and the high routes were lethal. But it could not account for the sheer number of the dead, or for the women and the apparent variety of people among them. A trading party is not 300 to 800 strong, and it does not include, as we will discover, people from opposite ends of the known world. A bolder theory imagined a lost army, a general's forgotten campaign, an entire military expedition that had marched into the mountains and perished. It is a dramatic idea, and the high passes of the Himalayas have indeed swallowed armies before. But the dead of Roopkund carried no military equipment, no swords or shields or armor befitting a war party. And there was a detail no army could explain. Among the bones were the unmistakable remains of women. This was no lost battalion. Could it have been a deliberate burial site, then? A remote, sacred place where bodies were carried to be laid to rest? Some wondered if Roopkund was a kind of high-altitude graveyard. But this, too, collapses under scrutiny. The bodies were not buried, or arranged, or interred with any ritual care. They were scattered where they fell, in and around the open water. Nothing about the scene suggested a chosen resting place. It suggested something sudden, something that caught them all at once. That mix of people kept defeating every neat explanation. Men and women, the young and the old. Not a single profession or purpose, but a cross-section of humanity. The kind of group you'd expect from a pilgrimage or a community on the move, rather than an army or a merchant caravan. Whatever had gathered these people and brought them to this lake, it had not been selective. It had taken them all, indiscriminately, in one place. And the position of the dead was itself a clue. They lay around the shore and in the shallows, out in the open, not crushed beneath rock, not entombed in snow, not sealed in any grave. An avalanche buries, a landslide crushes, a disease leaves bodies wherever the sick lay down to die. But this was a crowd of people, struck down together in the open air, near the water, all at once. The scene was pointing at something. If only the investigators could read it. What made it all the more maddening was the silence of history. An event large enough to kill hundreds of people in one place should have left an echo, a chronicle, a legend, a line in some ancient record. Yet for the longest time, there was almost nothing. No contemporary account of a great disaster at this lake. The mountains had simply absorbed the catastrophe and said nothing. The investigators were left with a crime scene 1,000 years cold, and no witnesses at all. One by one, the theories fell. Not soldiers, not a buried graveyard, not, most likely, a simple epidemic. Each idea explained a piece of the puzzle and then shattered on some stubborn fact. The women, the open scene, the strange consistency of it all. And it was that consistency that finally pointed the way. Because when the researchers stopped asking who these people were and started asking exactly how their bodies had been broken, the bones gave them an answer that fit at last. The skulls. Again and again, investigators found themselves returning to the heads of the dead, because it was there, on the crowns of those skulls, that the same grim signature appeared on body after body, a pattern so specific that it ruled out almost everything else and pointed unmistakably in a single direction. Up. Every theory kept breaking on the same hard fact: the wounds. When researchers examined the skulls, they found something that none of the popular explanations could account for. A consistent, repeated pattern of injury. Deep, blunt force fractures concentrated on the tops of the heads and the shoulders. Not the sides. Not the result of falling or fighting or being buried. These people had been struck with tremendous force by round, heavy objects coming down from directly above them. From above. Think about what that means at 16,000 feet, on an open meadow, with no trees and no shelter for miles. What comes down from the sky with enough force to crack a human skull, striking hundreds of people at once across an exposed mountainside? The answer, when researchers finally landed on it, was so simple and so brutal that it matched something the local people had been singing about for centuries. Hail. Not the harmless pellets that rattle a window. Hailstones the size of cricket balls. Lumps of ice up to several centimeters across, falling from the high storm clouds that build over these peaks with terrifying speed. At terminal velocity, a hailstone that size hits with the force of a cricket ball thrown by a fast bowler. Now imagine not one, but a relentless barrage of them, hammering down on a crowd of people with nowhere to run. This was the theory that finally fit the evidence. Forensic studies and a careful re-examination in the early 2000s concluded that the dead of Roopkund had most likely been killed by a sudden, catastrophic hailstorm. Caught in the open, on the exposed terrain near the lake, with no shelter of any kind, they would have had no defense. The largest hailstones would have struck the highest points, the head and shoulders, exactly where the fractures appear. Death would have come fast and from the sky. And then the mountain did what it always does. The cold preserved them. Over the years, meltwater carried some of the bodies down into the lake, and the freezing temperatures held them, bones, flesh, and all, for 1,000 years and more. It was an elegant, horrifying answer, a freak storm, a pitiless landscape, and a deep freeze that turned a tragedy into a time capsule. For a while, it seemed the mystery of Skeleton Lake was solved. And here is where the science met something older. Because the people of these mountains did not need a forensic study to tell them how the dead of Roopkund had died. They already knew. They had been singing about it for generations in a folk song passed down through the villages, sung by the women of the region. A song about a goddess and her terrible anger, and a storm of ice as hard as iron. To understand why that song sent a chill down the spine of the scientists who heard it, we have to leave the laboratory behind and step into the legend of the goddess Nanda Devi. In the mountains of Uttarakhand, Nanda Devi is more than a mountain. She is a goddess, one of the most revered deities of the region, a fierce mother figure who watches over these high places and demands respect from all who enter them. The peak that bears her name is sacred ground, and the lake of Roopkund lies directly on one of her most important pilgrimage routes. To the people here, this is not empty wilderness. It is the goddess's own land, and it has rules. Every 12 years, a great pilgrimage called the Nanda Devi Raj Jat winds through this landscape, a journey of hundreds of kilometers on foot, honoring the goddess, passing near Roopkund itself on the way to an even higher sacred site. It is one of the most important religious events in the region, and it is governed by strict tradition. By custom, women are not permitted to travel all the way to the lake. They wait in a village below. The mountain is holy. To break its rules is to invite disaster. And legend says that long ago, a king did exactly that. The story is told of Raja Jasdaval, the king of Kanauj. According to the legend, he set out on the sacred pilgrimage to the Nanda Devi shrine. And he did not travel humbly. He brought his pregnant queen, Rani Balampa. He brought servants and a troupe of dancers and musicians. His procession was a grand and worldly thing. Music, celebration, luxury, carried into the most sacred and austere of places. And there, in the goddess's own land, the legend says they crossed a line. They danced, they played music, they feasted. Some versions of the tale say they cooked meat, an act forbidden on that holy ground. Whatever the precise sin, the meaning is the same. They treated a sacred place as a stage for their own indulgence. They disrespected the goddess in her own home. And Nanda Devi's response was not subtle. The goddess, the legend says, was filled with fury, and she sent down a punishment from the sky. A storm of hailstones, hard as iron, raining onto the king and his entire procession. There was no shelter and no mercy. The king, the queen, the dancers, the servants, all of them perished there near the lake, struck down by the goddess's wrath. Their bodies were left where they fell, on the goddess's mountain, as a warning to all who would follow. For centuries, this story lived on in a folk song. The women of these mountain villages still sing it, a song describing how the goddess Nanda Devi sent hailstones as hard as iron down upon those who had offended her, killing them as they made their way past the lake. It was treated as myth, a morality tale, a way of teaching respect for the mountains and their goddess. Until the scientists arrived, examined the skulls, and realized that the song was describing exactly what the evidence showed. Hailstones, as hard as iron. Blunt force wounds on the tops of the heads from objects falling out of the sky. The folk song and the forensic report were telling the same story. A people caught in the open, killed by a storm of ice from above. It is one of those rare, eerie moments where ancient legend and modern science shake hands across 1,000 years. And for a time, that seemed to be the end of it. The myth was true. The case was closed. To grasp how deeply this legend is woven into the land, you have to understand the pilgrimage that still honors the goddess today. Once every 12 years, the people of these mountains undertake the Nanda Devi Raj Jat, a sacred journey on foot that stretches for hundreds of kilometers, climbing from the lowlands all the way into the high peaks. It is one of the longest and most arduous religious pilgrimages in the Himalayas, and its path leads directly past Roopkund, on the way to an even higher sacred site beyond. The pilgrimage carries a 4-horned ram, said to lead the goddess home to the heights, and ends at a place even more remote than Roopkund. For the pilgrims, this is not tourism and not adventure. It is an act of devotion that has been performed in some form for centuries, a living thread connecting the people of today to the same paths and the same dangers that the ancient dead once walked. When you stand at Skeleton Lake, you stand on a road that has been sacred and lethal for a very long time. The tradition carries strict rules, and one of them is striking in light of the legend. By custom, women do not travel all the way to the lake. They wait in the villages below, while the men continue into the highest, holiest ground. Whether or not that rule existed in ancient times, it echoes the old story with eerie precision. A tale in which a king's gravest offense was bringing his queen and his dancers and his worldly celebration into a place where they did not belong. The mountain, the tradition says, must be approached with humility, or not at all. And through all those centuries, with no written chronicle to preserve it, the memory survived in the one place that outlasts paper: the human voice. The folk song of the goddess's wrath was sung from mother to daughter, generation after generation, long after the event that inspired it had faded from any official record. It was treated as a story, a way to teach respect for the mountains. No one expected it to be evidence. And yet, locked inside that song was a description of how the dead had died. Imagine the moment for the researchers. They had spent years examining fractured skulls, concluding that these people were killed by round objects falling from above, by a storm of giant hail. And then they encountered the local song, a goddess sending down hailstones as hard as iron to kill those who climbed past her lake. The forensics and the folklore were not just compatible, they were describing the same event from 2,000 years and two worlds apart, one in the language of science, one in the language of faith. It is one of the most haunting convergences in all of archaeology. A community killed in the open by ice from the sky. A song that remembered it when history forgot. For a moment, it seemed the mystery had been answered twice over, by the bones and by the ballad, in perfect agreement. The legend was not superstition, it was memory. And the case of Skeleton Lake appeared at last to be closed. A grand pilgrimage, an offended goddess, a storm of iron hail, remembered in song and confirmed in bone. It was elegant, it was satisfying, it even felt just. But the most dangerous thing in any investigation is an answer that feels too complete, because it tempts you to stop looking. And the technology that would force everyone to look again and to see how wrong they had been was still waiting to be invented. A grand pilgrimage, an offended goddess, a storm of iron hail, hundreds dead in a single terrible afternoon, their bones preserved by the ice for a millennium. It was a satisfying answer, folklore and forensics in perfect agreement. But satisfying answers are not always complete answers. And the technology that would finally pull the truth out of these bones had not yet been invented. Because in the years that followed, a revolution swept through archaeology. Scientists learned how to extract and read ancient DNA, to pull genetic information out of bones thousands of years old, and reconstruct who a person had been, where their ancestors had lived, even what they had eaten. And when that technology was finally turned on the bones of Roopkund, it did not confirm the tidy story of the king and the goddess. it detonated it. What the geneticists found in those bones was something no legend, no folk song, and no forensic study had ever predicted. The dead of Roopkund were not who anyone thought they were, and they had not died the way the story said. In 2019, the results of a massive 5-year international study were published in the journal Nature Communications. 28 researchers from institutions across India, the United States, and Europe had set out to finally answer the question of who the dead of Roopkund really were. They extracted genome-wide DNA from the bones of 38 individuals, drilling fine powder from the long bones and reading the genetic code locked inside. What they found rewrote everything. The 38 people did not form one single population. They fell into 3 genetically distinct groups, 3 different kinds of people with 3 different origins, buried around the same tiny lake. And the differences between them were not subtle. They were vast, so vast that they should never, by any logic, have ended up in the same place at all. The first and largest group, 23 of the 38 individuals, had ancestry that falls squarely within the range of present-day South Asians, people of the subcontinent. This much fit the old story. These could have been the pilgrims of the legend, climbing the goddess's mountain. And when scientists dated their bones with radiocarbon analysis, the results pointed to roughly 1,200 years ago, around 800 of the Common Era, the 7th to 10th centuries, the era of the legend itself. So far, so consistent. A group of South Asian people dying near Roopkund around the 9th century, exactly when the legend of King Just of All is supposed to have unfolded. If the story had ended there, the goddess and the hailstorm would have stood. But the scientists noticed something even within this first group that quietly cracked the old assumption. These people had not all died together in one event. The evidence suggested they had been deposited at the lake across more than one occasion. Roopkund had claimed South Asian lives more than once. Already, the single storm theory was in trouble. But that was nothing compared to what the second group revealed. Because among the 38 dead of Skeleton Lake, 14 individuals carried ancestry that had no business being anywhere near the Himalayas. Their genetic signature did not point to India or Tibet or anywhere in Asia. It pointed thousands of kilometers away to the eastern Mediterranean, to the islands of Greece, most closely to the people of Crete. Stop and feel the strangeness of that. People whose ancestors came from the Greek islands, from the warm, sunlit shores of the Mediterranean, lying dead
buried in a frozen lake at the foot of the Himalayas. It is hard to imagine two places on Earth more different. The distance between Crete and Roopkund is over 5,000 kilometers, and yet here they were, their bones mingled with the others, on the roof of the world.
And then came the detail that turned the whole mystery inside out. The scientists dated this Mediterranean group, and they did not die around 800 with the South Asian pilgrims. They died around 1800, the 19th century, a full 1,000 years later. The two main groups of dead at Roopkund were separated in time by roughly 1,000 years. They never met. They never could have met. They died in the same impossibly remote spot, 10 centuries apart. This single finding demolished the elegant old answer. The legend of the king and the goddess could not explain a group of Greeks who died 1,000 years after the king was supposed to have. The story of one catastrophic afternoon could not explain deaths spread across a millennium. Whatever was happening at Roopkund, it was not a single event. It was a pattern. The lake was not the scene of one tragedy. It was the scene of many. The scientists pushed further, analyzing the chemistry of the bones to reconstruct what these people had eaten, a technique called stable isotope analysis. And the diets confirmed the divide. The South Asian group had eaten a varied diet, including millet, typical of the many regions of the subcontinent. The Mediterranean group had eaten almost no millet at all, a completely different pattern, consistent with people who had grown up far away on entirely different food. These were not locals who happened to carry distant ancestry. They were outsiders, strangers in this land. And there was one more, a 38th individual who fit neither group. This single person carried ancestry pointing toward Southeast Asia, East Asian-related roots, distinct from both the Indians and the Greeks. They appear to have died in the same later period as the Mediterranean group, around 1800. One lone traveler from yet another part of the world, who also met their end at Skeleton Lake. Perhaps a guide, perhaps a companion. We may never know. It's worth pausing on just how difficult this science is, because it makes the results all the more remarkable. DNA does not last forever. Over centuries, it breaks into smaller and smaller fragments, contaminated by bacteria, by the environment, by everyone who has ever handled the bones. Recovering a readable genome from 1,000-year-old remains is painstaking work, possible only in the last couple of decades. Roopkund's frozen, dry conditions helped,
The same code that preserved the flesh also protected the genetic code locked deep inside the bone.
To read it, scientists drilled tiny amounts of powder from deep inside the long bones, the parts least touched by contamination, and rebuilt the genetic sequences in specialized clean rooms, where a single stray molecule of modern DNA could ruin everything. It was a global effort. An international team of around 28 researchers from institutions across India, Europe, and the United States, pooling expertise in genetics, archaeology, and chemistry. The goal was simple to state and enormously hard to achieve: to make the dead of Roopkund tell us who they had been. The way you determine someone's ancestry from ancient DNA is by comparison. You take their genetic signature and measure it against the patterns found in populations around the world, past and present, to see where they fit. When the team did this for the Roopkund dead, the results did not blur together into a single regional group, as you'd expect from one community. They snapped apart into distinct clusters, separated by the kind of genetic distance you only see between populations from entirely different parts of the globe. The bones revealed other quiet truths, too. Of the 38 individuals studied, around 15 were women, confirming beyond doubt that this was no army and no all-male trading party, but a true cross-section of people. They had been somebody's mothers, daughters, wives, sisters. Whatever drew them to this lake, it drew families and communities, not just fighters or merchants. And that only deepened the sorrow of the place. An entire slice of humanity ended here, at the edge of the world. Even within the South Asian group, there was surprising variety. Their diets, revealed by the chemistry of their bones, were highly varied, some relying on one set of crops, some on another, suggesting they came from a range of different regions and walks of life across the subcontinent. This wasn't a single village that had climbed up together. It looked more like people drawn from many places, gathered for a shared purpose. Exactly the kind of group a great pilgrimage would assemble. And then there was the detail that should have been the first warning sign. Even the South Asian group, the dating suggested, had not all died in a single moment. There was evidence that they had been deposited at the lake across more than one event, perhaps several separate tragedies spread over the 7th to 10th centuries. The single catastrophic afternoon was already cracking before anyone even looked at the foreign bones. Roopkund had been collecting the dead for a long, long time. So when the scientists finally stepped back and assembled everything, the 3 genetic clusters, the radiocarbon dates, the diets, the evidence of repeated events, the picture that emerged was nothing like the legend they had started with. It was bigger, stranger,
and far more troubling. 3 peoples, 2 main eras, multiple deaths across 1,000 years. Let's lay it out clearly, because this is the heart of what the bones revealed. So here is what the bones of Roopkund actually contain. A large group of South Asians who died around the 9th century, possibly in more than one event. A group of 14 people of Eastern Mediterranean descent from the region of Greece and Crete, who died around the 19th century. And a single individual of Southeast Asian ancestry from that same later time. 3 peoples, 2 eras 1,000 years apart, 1 lake, and almost no idea why any of them were there. The study had been meant to solve the mystery. Instead, it had multiplied it. The single greatest question, the one that the hailstorm answered so neatly, had been how they died. But the DNA had quietly shifted the entire mystery onto a different, harder question. Not how. Why? Why were these people here at all? And the new version of that question is almost impossible to answer. Because of all the impossible things about Skeleton Lake, the strangest is this. A group of people from the Greek islands who somehow traveled to the far side of the world and died at a frozen lake in the Indian Himalayas around the year 1800. And left behind not a single written record that anyone has ever found. Let's sit with the puzzle of the Mediterranean group, because it is the deepest part of the entire mystery. Around the year 1800, 14 people whose ancestry traces to the Eastern Mediterranean, to Greece, to Crete, died together at Roopkund Lake. They appear to have perished in a single event, and they were a long, long way from home. Now, 1800 is not the distant, undocumented past. This is the modern era. By this time, the British East India Company was a dominant power across India. Records were kept, travelers were logged, Europeans in India were noticed, accounted for, written about. If a party of 14 people from the Mediterranean had traveled all the way to northern India and then vanished in the high Himalayas, you would expect there to be some trace of them. A letter, a report, a missing persons account, a legend even. There is nothing. Historians have searched, and the silence is total. There is no record of a Greek expedition to this region, no account of foreign pilgrims, no diplomatic note, no missionary report, no trader's ledger that mentions them. 14 people from the other side of the world climbed into one of the most dangerous places on Earth and died there. And history simply does not know they existed. we only know because their bones gave them away. 200 years later.
So the theories begin again. Only now they are wilder, because the facts are stranger. One idea, that they were merchants, traders from the Ottoman world perhaps, using some little-known high-altitude route through the mountains toward Tibet, chasing goods or profit along a path that has since been forgotten. It is possible. The mountains have always hidden trade routes, but there is no evidence of such a route here, and no reason a trading party would include the particular mix of people the bones reveal.
Another idea, that they too were pilgrims, that for some reason a group of Mediterranean people had joined or imitated the sacred Nanda Devi pilgrimage, climbing the same deadly route the South Asians had walked 1,000 years before. But why would Greeks make a Hindu pilgrimage to a goddess from a faith not their own? What would draw them specifically to this lake, on this mountain, half a world from home? No one has a convincing answer.
Some have wondered whether they were not visitors at all, but the descendants of some isolated, long-settled population, a community of Mediterranean origin that had lived somewhere in the region for generations, their story lost to history. But the dietary evidence argues against it. The chemistry of their bones shows they had not grown up eating the local foods. They were not locals carrying old foreign blood. They appear to have come from far away and relatively recently. They were, in the most literal sense, strangers who died in a strange land. And the lone Southeast Asian individual only sharpens the riddle. One person of yet another distant origin, dying alongside the Mediterranean group. Were they a guide hired for the journey? A companion picked up along the way? A member of some mixed party whose true purpose has been completely erased? Every answer raises 3 more questions. Every thread, when you pull it, leads only deeper into the fog. There is one grim thread that may connect them across the centuries. The how, at least, may be the same. The hailstorm theory still likely explains the cause of death for both groups, because at 16,000 feet, on that open ground, the weather is the deadliest thing there is, and it does not care what century it is, or where you were born. 1,000 years apart, 2 groups of strangers may have died in exactly the same way, caught in the open, beneath a sky raining ice. But that only deepens the dread, rather than relieving it, because it means Roopkund is not a place where a tragedy happened once. It is a place where the same kind of tragedy happened repeatedly, to completely unrelated people across a span of 1,000 years. Pilgrims in the 9th century, strangers from the Mediterranean
in the 19th. The lake does not seem to have a single dark afternoon in its past. It has a habit.
And that raises perhaps the most haunting question of all. Why here? Of all the points along these vast mountain routes, why did unrelated groups of people, separated by centuries and oceans, all converge on this one tiny lake to die? Is it simply that the geography funnels travelers to this exact basin, that anyone crossing this range on foot ends up here, exposed when the storms come? Or is there something we still don't understand about why this particular place keeps filling with the dead?
The science gave us so much. It told us who they were. South Asians, Mediterraneans, a lone soul from the southeast. It told us when they died, across 1,000 years. It even told us, most likely, how. But it could not tell us why they came. And it could not tell us why this lake, again and again, became their grave. The bones answered every question we knew how to ask, and revealed a deeper one we never thought to.
And while we argue over the dead,
The lake itself is changing. Because the deep freeze that preserved this mystery for 1,000 years is right now beginning to fail.
the Himalayas are warming. The glaciers that have crowned these peaks for millennia are retreating, and the climate that kept Roopkund frozen and stable is shifting beneath it. The lake has been shrinking. Landslides scar the surrounding slopes more often, and the delicate balance that turned this place into a perfect natural deep freeze, the cold, the ice, the stillness, is being disturbed for the first time in the entire span of this story. For the bones, this is a quiet catastrophe. The remains that survived 1,000 years only because they were locked in ice and cold are now more exposed, more vulnerable, more likely to wash away, scatter, or simply degrade. Every season that the ice retreats a little further, a little more of the record is lost. The lake is slowly erasing its own evidence, taking back the secret it held for so long before we have finished reading it. And the bones faced a second threat, this one entirely human. As the Roopkund trek exploded in popularity, the sheer number of visitors began to damage everything the site stood for. The fragile alpine meadows were trampled. The bones were handled, moved, and stolen. A place of profound archaeological and spiritual importance was being steadily destroyed by the very people who came to marvel at it. Something had to give. And so, in recent years, the authorities made a decision to protect the fragile ecosystem of the Bugyals and to preserve what remains of the dead.
Trekking all the way to Roopkund Lake was restricted. The great adventure tourism route that had carried thousands to Skeleton Lake was, in large part, closed off. Trekkers can still climb to the meadows below, but the Lake of the Dead, for now, has been returned to its silence and to its goddess.
There is even a darker, more modern fear attached to the site. With so many bodies frozen for so long, scientists have raised the possibility that ancient bacteria or viruses could be preserved in the ice along with them. Pathogens from another age, dormant in the cold. It is a reminder that this is not a museum exhibit, but a real and complicated place where the past is not as safely buried as we like to think. The lake guards its dead in more ways than one. There is a quiet race underway now between the scientists who want to study Roopkund and the warming climate that is unmaking it. Every fragment of bone, every artifact, every trace of DNA still frozen in that basin is a page of a story we have only begun to read. And the ice that has held those pages together for a millennium is loosening its grip. Researchers know that what is not recorded soon may be lost forever, washed down the slopes, or degraded beyond recovery. And the science is far from finished. The genetic study answered some questions and raised others, and new techniques continue to emerge. Finer dating, deeper genetic analysis, better ways to reconstruct diet, health, and origin from the faintest traces. It is entirely possible that the next breakthrough about Roopkund is still locked inside bones already sitting in a laboratory drawer, waiting for a tool that hasn't been invented yet. The lake may still have answers to give, if we can reach them in time. But there is an ethical weight to all of this that the science alone cannot resolve. These are not merely specimens. They were people, pilgrims, travelers, families, who died terrible deaths far from home. They lie in a place that the living still hold sacred. Every drill into a bone, every sample carried down the mountain is a small intrusion on a grave. Researchers and local communities alike have had to weigh the hunger to know against the duty to respect. The dead of Roopkund cannot consent to being studied. We can only try to do it with care. And some of those pages are already gone. Not to the climate, but to human hands. Every skull carried off as a souvenir, every bone pocketed by a careless trekker was a piece of evidence destroyed. We will never know what those stolen remains might have told us, whether they belonged to the ancient pilgrims or the mysterious strangers, whether they held the clue that finally explained the lake. The looting didn't just steal objects, it stole answers forever. That
is the hard logic behind the decision to close the trail. For now, the great trek to Skeleton Lake is largely silent. No long lines of trekkers, no camps beside the bones, no hands disturbing the dead. To some, it is a loss, one of the world's most extraordinary destinations placed out of reach. But to the mountain and to the people who revere it, it is something closer to justice. The goddess's land has been given back its quiet. So Roopkund sits today in a strange suspension, studied but not solved, protected but slowly vanishing, sacred and scientific at once. Each year, the ice melts a little, reveals a little, and takes a little back. And somewhere in that frozen basin, the answer to the deepest question may still be waiting, or may already have washed away. We are, in a real sense, reading a book as its pages dissolve. For the people who live in these mountains, none of this is surprising. To them, Roopkund was never an unsolved scientific puzzle. It was always the goddess's land, a sacred, dangerous place that demands respect and punishes those who fail to give it. The science has added astonishing layers to the story. The three peoples, the 1,000-year gap, the Mediterranean strangers. But it has not displaced the older understanding. If anything, the deeper the mystery grows, the more the old reverence makes a kind of sense. And so we are left, after 80 years of investigation and the most advanced science on Earth, with a lake that has given us everything except an ending. So who are the dead of Roopkund? After everything, the Ranger's discovery, the failed theories, the hailstorm, the goddess, the DNA, we can finally say a few things with certainty. They were not Japanese soldiers. They were not victims of a single afternoon. They were South Asians and Mediterraneans and one lone traveler from the southeast. They died across 1,000 years in a place none of them should ever have reached. And most of them, in all likelihood, were killed by ice falling from the sky. But the heart of it remains untouched. We do not know why a party of Greeks crossed the world to die at a frozen Himalayan lake around the year 1800. We do not know why no record of them survives. We do not know why this exact lake, this exact basin, claimed unrelated lives 1,000 years apart. The science answered the question we started with and handed us a stranger one we cannot close. Maybe that is fitting. Some mysteries are not puzzles to be solved, but reminders of how much the world keeps from us. Roopkund has been giving up its dead, one thaw at a time, for over 1,000 years. years, and it has never once explained itself. The South Asian pilgrims, the Greek strangers, the lone soul from the East, their stories ended here on the goddess's mountain, and the ice has kept the rest. And now, as the climate warms and the ice retreats, that window is closing. The lake that preserved its secret for a millennium is beginning to let it slip away. Whatever answers still lie frozen in those bones, we may be running out of time to read them. Skeleton Lake is dissolving back into the mountain and taking its last mysteries with it. A village of the dead at the top of the world. People from 3 corners of the earth gathered by a force we still don't understand, in a place that should hold no one at all. The goddess, the locals say, is still watching, and the lake of skeletons keeps its secrets, frozen for now beneath the ice. Thank you for climbing to Skeleton Lake with me. If this mystery gripped you, there are countless more like it, places where science and legend collide, and neither one wins. Subscribe, and I'll take you to the next one. And if you have a theory about the Greeks of Roopkund, leave it in the comments. After 200 years, your guess may be as good as anyone.